There's no surprise today that when we pay closer attention to the geopolitics, and of course, it's one hand that we ask the question, why is it getting so complicated? And plus, it's only the 4 months into 2026. But on the other hand, the international community are dying to hear whether there's something that we can learn from the historical perspective. Again, guests appear on our shows over the years have talked about how history can serve as a reminders and also interpretation to understand what's happening these days, and especially we pay attention to the leadership. Of course, today, when we talk about leadership, it's not just about who's sitting in the White House or who has more power when it comes to war. It's really about the word responsibility and also about maturity. Well, looking back in the history, we know that two people who are rather famous, but they're distinctively different. For example, what about Winston Churchill? And what about Charles de Gaulle? And what do we know about the two people? And what about the relationship between the two leaders? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who's the Dr. Richard Vinen. Dr. Vinen specializes in 20th century history. His current research on modern Britain, and he published the previous book, Thatcher's Britain, and is currently working on a study of military service and a post-war Britain. And his new book, which I strongly encourage everyone to get a copy, it's called The Last Titans: How Churchill and De Gaulle saved their nations and transformed the world. Well, Dr. Vinen, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thank you very much. It's good to be with you.
Absolutely, sir. The honor is mine. Again, it's such a privilege to speak to you. I want to get started. You know, it's interesting that you book talk about the two distinctive characters, Winston Churchill and Charles de Gaulle. And right off the bat, that in this book, and this is something that you wrote, and I quote, and I love for you to explain a little bit more. This is what you wrote, and de Gaulle says his idea of France, it's like the princess in the tale. De Gaulle understood and expected his readers to understand, and that his idea of France was a fairy tale. We know from the historical perspective, Charles de Gaulle was not a stranger, you know, despite his personality and also the way he conducted the military, etc. But I have to say, we have not seen this romantic side or this mellow side of de Gaulle. So can you start by explaining a little bit what inspired you or what motivated you to create this book about de Gaulle and Winston Churchill, and also why do you think that he said that France, it's like the princess in the tale? Your thoughts?
So what made me want to write the book is partly that these are just two very fascinating individuals. So they're both rare examples, I suppose, of men who would be extraordinary even if they'd never held political power. And then partly because I'm a historian of Britain and France, and these are in some ways the kind of iconic, most important individuals in British and French history in the 20th century. And beyond just being important figures, they're also people who become seen as representatives of their country. So it's not just what they do and what they say, it's also what other people project onto them. So they become kind of almost symbols of their country. So I thought that was interesting, and I thought the interaction between them was interesting. So obviously, there are all sorts of international interactions, but I suppose the rare thing about Churchill and de Gaulle is that they're two great national leaders who are actually in the same city at a crucial part of their lives. So because de Gaulle takes refuge in London, so there is a period in which their lives are very kind of intimately intertangled.
Well, Dr. Vinen, let's keep our conversation going, because again, you mentioned Winston Churchill, and of course, you know, for anyone that I would say the person doesn't have to be a historian or doesn't have to be so much interested in reading about history, but Winston Churchill, it's not just a name. I would say it has become a symbol, has become a reputation, so to speak. But a fascinating part about Churchill that you wrote in the book is, and I quote, Churchill cared deeply about his reputation, but could be indifferent to his dignity. I have to say that when I came across this line, I was puzzled, confused and not ready for this type of description for Winston Churchill. Because again, we look at what happened over the centuries, and we'll look at this political and historical transformation of the world, and of course, talk about the Great Britain. Winston Churchill, that he cared about his reputation, but not about his dignity, help our audience to unwrap that a little bit. Why did he do that? And also, how did such personality, or how did such, I would say, characters shape the way he delegated tasks over the periods?
So I think the key to Churchill is that, first of all, in some ways, of course, Churchill is an immensely confident man, and Churchill is very much a member of the British ruling class, which partly confers this confidence on him. He always knows that he's been born into the ruling class. He's the grandson of a duke. He's the son of a cabinet minister. He's a man who himself is at the front line of British politics from the age of 25. Remember, he's been in the British Parliament for 40 years by the time he becomes Prime Minister in 1940. So in that sense, he's already kind of very established. He's already very well known to other members of the ruling class. And I think because of that, he doesn't have to stand on his dignity. So he can be very kind of self-mocking at times, so that he doesn't particularly care about whether he's laughed at times. I mean, obviously, he assumes that it's usually affectionate laughter, but he doesn't mind the idea that he might have quite informal relations with people. So I'll give you a couple of examples of this, one of which is in the middle of the war, there's a moment when he's talking to his private secretary, John Colville. Colville's much, much younger than him, 40 years younger than him. And he has a very good, amiable relationship with Colville. And he's talking to Colville as he gets undressed for bed. I mean, very characteristic of Churchill that he kind of talks to people in the bath, talks to them while he's dressing and undressing for bed and so on. And then suddenly, for some reason, Churchill falls down. And you might think, well, this is a man who's almost 70 years old. He's going to be embarrassed about falling down. But he's not at all. On the contrary, he thinks it's amusing. He can see that Colville is smiling. So he then does it again just to amuse Colville. And then he says, pure Charlie Chaplin. So that he's very good at that kind of thing. And of course, that's one of the things that makes him an enticing figure in some ways, the idea of a man who can be so important but not take himself entirely seriously. And it also means he's a person of extraordinary charm, so he can win people over very well. And he can display this in all sorts of odd ways. So there's always, obviously in Churchill, and indeed in De Gaulle sometimes, they're both witty men when they want to be. But Churchill especially has a propensity to spontaneous wit. He can make things funny, even in very desperate circumstances. So two of my favourite remarks are in the House of Commons in 1940, when Britain is being bombed. He says that Parliament should take precautions against bombing. And then he says that, of course, he realises that honourable members of Parliament won't wish to appear cowardly, but he says they must take these precautions seriously. And then he suddenly says, because 300 or 400 by-elections will be very inconvenient at the present time. So, Britain is fighting for its survival, and he tells Parliament, well, it'd be frightfully inconvenient if 300 or 400 of you were killed tomorrow. There's a moment when the British decide, after their victory at El Alamein, first real victory of the war for them, that they will allow the church bells to be rung. And the church bells have not been rung for a while because they're reserved as a symbol of invasion. They'll be going to be used as the signal if the country is invaded. Churchill allows the bells to be rung again, and someone asks him about this in the House of Commons, and he says, he says he thinks that now we've passed the moment when we need signal of invasion. And then he suddenly says, again, those kind of strange little moments when you can see Churchill thinking of something and kind of smiling to himself as he thinks of it. He says, I'm sure that any news of any really large-scale invasion would be sure to leak out. So he can take the mickey out of himself, as we would say in England, in that way. Occasionally, De Gaulle, who I think is a much more formal man, does the same. There's a wonderful moment. De Gaulle, at a press conference in the mid-1960s, at the height of his power, is asked by a journalist about a particular embarrassing thing that the government has done, where obviously it's made a mistake. And the journalist says, to what do you attribute this, mon général? And de Gaulle just shrugs. He's now in his mid-70s. He's the most important man in France. And he says, I attribute it to my inexperience. And everybody laughs because, of course, de Gaulle is by far the most experienced politician in France.
Well, I mean, again, Dr. Vinen, it's fascinating to listen to this witty and also, this smart ways from Churchill and also de Gaulle. But let's talk about another historical perspective. In your book, that you specifically dedicated a unique chapter, which is entitled The Fall of France. And we know that, again, as I mentioned before, you don't have to be a historian to understand this dramatic or tremendous change behind the scene. If I say, put in a sense that we can understand it to our viewers, it's like we're watching a movie, and when we expect the climax, when we expect the good news, but I'm sorry to say that the table turned and the fate of the country suddenly take a toll. So, and of course, and also at the beginning, the chapter, that you wrote a quote that from de Gaulle, and I quote, is, in the 1940s, for the first time, we acted as though we were not a great power. Dr. Vinen, talk a little bit more. Why do you think it's crucial to have a chapter dedicated to the fall of France? And also, how do you think that see the fall of France that can actually reveal the authenticity of Winston Churchill and also Charles de Gaulle? Because we know that, it's a cliche, is people are the product of the environment. The relationship and the friendships over the decades that shaped who we are and also indeed can contribute to our personality and also our personal growth in many ways. So by looking at this chapter, Fall of France, how do we understand the maturity and the growth of the two people? And again, you mentioned before, distinctly different, but they're wonderful leaders, and they have charming ways to really understand the do's and don'ts. Let me hear your thoughts.
Sure. So, first of all, I think the fall of France is enormously important, partly because France has been a great military power. So France, in lots of ways, has been a military power since the 17th century, since Napoleon. Churchill and de Gaulle are both very fascinated by Napoleon, probably Churchill even more than de Gaulle, and then particularly during the First World War. So France is the country that probably contributes most to Allied victory in the First World War. France, of course, has taken much more heavy casualties than Britain. France really leads the fighting in the First World War. And then in the 1930s, France is still regarded as this very important military power. And the British, who have a comparatively small army, really rest their kind of survival on two things, one of which is their command of the sea, which they retain, and one of which is the idea that the French army will continue to command the land. Now, in 1940, that French military power seems to fall apart very quickly. So they're circumvented by German troops in Belgium, who cut behind what they had expected to be their lines. The Maginot Line, which they had expected, they always knew the Germans would go round the Maginot Line, but they assumed that that would provide them with a greater advantage than it did. So France falls very, very quickly. And the French defeat is, on the one hand, a military defeat, but it's also a political defeat. So there's a sense the French government kind of falls apart, loses its grip on power, leaves Paris, very importantly, and therefore is the government itself is physically retreating across the country, but also that the government is very badly divided, and that eventually Marshal Pétain, who's been brought into the government by Paul Reynaud, who's the last prime minister of what becomes Third Republic France, or what is Third Republic France, what becomes the end of Third Republic France. Marshal Pétain has been brought into that government hoping he will make it stronger. But in fact, Marshal Pétain is ultimately the man who kind of moves to undermine the government and to seek an armistice with the Germans. So there's this very quick, really takes place over a period of 6 weeks, very dramatic, very confusing, and very humiliating defeat for the French, which de Gaulle doesn't accept. So de Gaulle says, we don't have to go along with this defeat. The key thing is that although France has been militarily defeated on the mainland, she can fight on elsewhere. So there's a prospect that France might fight on from her overseas empire, that the French government might move to North Africa. And there's also the prospect, which de Gaulle ultimately seizes, that the government might, or that some elements might go into exile, which of course is what he does. He flies to London on the 17th of June 1940. So in that sense, the fall of France is tremendously important. I think it's tremendously important to Churchill because Churchill has actually invested a lot of hope in France. Churchill is a great Francophile, huge admirer of France, and particularly an admirer of Clemenceau, the great leader of France during the First World War. So I think Churchill is very bitterly disappointed by the fall of France. He's very convinced that this then means there's a new kind of world. So his most famous speech probably ever, the speech he makes on the 18th of June 1940, the finest hour speech, begins with the words, "The battle of France is over, the battle of Britain has begun." And there's a real sense that, one thing follows the other. I think de Gaulle is obviously in a very different position in 1940. So Churchill has become British Prime Minister really during the fall of France. De Gaulle is still a very minor figure. He's a junior general, only really been appointed to the most junior rank of the French General Corps, and a very, very junior minister in the government. So he's appointed again during the fall of France to the government, but in this very minor ministerial post. So that de Gaulle is playing with a much weaker hand of cards than Churchill. And de Gaulle really makes this extraordinary gamble, which is that when the government collapses and when a new government is installed, what eventually becomes the Vichy government, which signs an armistice with the Germans, de Gaulle says, no, I will lead the resistance to this, even though he has very little formal position to do so. So de Gaulle is never head of a government in exile, but he says, I will set myself up as the figurehead of French resistance. And that's what takes him to London, and that what makes him deliver this great so-called call to honor when he broadcasts to the French people on the 18th of June 1940 and calls on them to go on resisting. So I think for those reasons, the fall of France really makes de Gaulle, or at least begins the creation of what becomes kind of de Gaulle's great image, but is also tremendously important to Churchill.
Well, Dr. Vinen, two more questions before letting you go. Now, fast forward. As I mentioned in the intro, modern day geopolitics are rather complicated. And of course, we're dealing with almost, I dare to say, two different personalities. In the US, we have Donald Trump. In UK, we have, a different charming British Prime Minister. And of course, in France today, we have Emmanuel Macron. So look at the complication and the intricacy of the geopolitics today. Do you think that there's anything that we should learn or we ought to learn from Charles de Gaulle and Winston Churchill? Of course, I'm sure that this question you've been asked many, many times, but I still want to dig a little deeper. How do you think that modern day politics, it's not, I dare to say, advancing the interests of the political games, but instead it's shrinking or it's retrieving from the progress? If you agree with me, go ahead.
Yeah, what can we learn from them? Well, first of all, we can learn that our situation is different from theirs. So Britain is not at the moment fighting for its national survival. So I think in a way it's a bit unfair to ask whether Keir Starmer is like Winston Churchill. We don't yet need a Winston Churchill. And of course, Winston Churchill is in lots of ways a desperate expedient that the British deploy in 1940. Churchill has all sorts of qualities that can make him dangerous. Churchill's like some, terrifying savage dog that you'd only take it off the lead when you really know that you're fighting for your life. So in that sense, I think we shouldn't necessarily assume that we're going to get a Winston Churchill again, and we should perhaps hope that we're never in such desperate circumstances that we need a Churchill again. I think also one should say both Churchill and de Gaulle are very much moulded by their own time. They're both in some ways men of the 19th century. They're both men who have to respond to particular challenges of the mid-20th century. I think a key difference between them, and this is obviously partly because Churchill is rather older than de Gaulle, and by the time Churchill gets into power, he's a bit more rooted in the past, and perhaps particularly after his finest hour, after 1940, he's a bit more rooted in the past. But that quotation you produced at the very beginning, where de Gaulle says France is like the princess in the fairy tale. I think the key insight that de Gaulle has is that sometimes politics is about illusion. And he knows that the whole identity of France is a bit of a fairy tale, that France is not really a great country after 1945, although in some ways he has to act as if it's a great country. So he knows there's an element of theatre behind his politics, an element of illusion. And he knows that illusion is necessary, but he also knows that one would be foolish if one gets entirely dominated by that illusion, if the politician himself begins to believe that illusion. There's a very striking speech that de Gaulle makes in the early 1960s. And at this stage, he's preparing France to lose Algeria. He's realized that the French control of Algeria has to go. France has to give up the most important part of her empire. And this is a very dramatic moment because people have really helped de Gaulle come back to power in 1958 precisely because they hoped he would keep that empire. But anyway, de Gaulle has realized this can't last. And he makes a speech in which he talks about his own nostalgia in a very evocative way. And he says, I was born in the age of the oil lamps and the fleet at sail and the age of the carriages, the horse-drawn carriages. And he really kind of creates this portrait of his youth. And then suddenly he bangs the table and he says, but that's all gone. And now we have to live with a new kind of world. So de Gaulle, I think, does understand the need to come to terms with new circumstances, which is obviously a crucial asset of any politician. So in a way, the most important thing we can learn from Churchill and de Gaulle is that we need sometimes to be free of their legacy and to say now it's a new world we're dealing with.
Well, Dr. Vinen, I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you the last question. Again, the book is called The Last Titans, How Churchill and de Gaulle Saved Their Nations and Transformed the World. Let's just say not everyone has basic understanding or some understanding about how those two amazing leaders saved their nations and also totally transformed the whole world. Dr. Vinen, what would you expect the readers to appreciate and understand when we finish reading the last chapter of this book? Because again, as I mentioned before, this is a wonderful read, and it's not just about the description, the journeys and the miles that those two people walk through, and let alone, the experiences, the leadership that they clearly demonstrated. There gotta be something deeper, something beyond the words can understand, that you as an author, what are your expectations from all of us? Your final thoughts.
So I suppose the key thing I'd like people to take away from this book is partly I hope they just enjoy it and that they're interested by these two personalities. But also I'd say that these are different kinds of individuals, de Gaulle and Churchill. In some ways, they're men of similar stature, but very different personalities and very different historical roles. So I suppose above all, Churchill is the man of 1940. And in 1940, Churchill does make a huge difference to Britain. And the fact that Britain fights on in very desperate circumstances is, I think, largely due to Churchill. And Churchill is a man of absolutely commanding influence in 1940. He's a world famous. If you read the famous article on the American century by American journalists talking about the coming American power, nonetheless, it starts by referring to Winston Churchill in London, who's kind of commanding everyone's attention at that time. I think the point is about Churchill, though, that he doesn't translate into the peacetime world very well. Churchill does come back as prime minister in the 1950s, but is never a very successful peacetime prime minister. And having been this magnificent wartime leader, that's really the end of his period of greatness. By contrast, I think de Gaulle plays a more minor role in the war itself, sometimes precisely because he plays a more minor role. I think that hones his political skills. There's nothing that makes you a better poker player than having to play with very weak cards. And I think that's what de Gaulle learns to do during the war. And then he too comes back as a peacetime leader, having apparently been displaced after the war, but is brought back to power in 1958, and then is a very, very successful peacetime leader between 1958 and 1969, when he's a spectacular figure. He's not just head of government, but head of state in France. And I think remolds France in a very clever way, where precisely he understands the need for a rhetoric of grandeur, a rhetoric of greatness. But he uses that partly actually to help the French into, on the one hand, what's really a more modest conception of France's role in the world, but also a great burst of modernization in economic terms. So France very successfully does adjust to the modern world under de Gaulle, even though de Gaulle himself often seems a rather unmodern character. So I think that's de Gaulle's great kind of achievement.
Well, again, Professor, it's such an honor to have you on our show. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Richard Vinen, he's the author of this amazing book, The Last Titans, How Churchill and De Gaulle Saved Their Nations and Transformed the World. And I strongly encourage everyone to connect with Dr. Vinen online, and also, of course, grab a copy of this book and get started on reading and really find out not only about Winston Churchill and Charles de Gaulle, but also about how those two distinct characters indeed built relationships, friendships, and contributed to the success of the world. Again, Dr. Vinen, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure. We'd love to have you back on the show as we continue to pay closer attention to the global affairs. So thank you so much for doing this.